Today I'm going to show a very useful way to immediately bounce psytrance basslines into audio that is clean and works with the kick and doesn't overlap with other notes. Um, I will show exactly what that means just to make it more clear. So here's an example of a psytrance bassline. Let me get this out of the way. Here's an example of a psytrance bassline. We'll just listen to a couple seconds of it. And before I press this, I will not take credit for this bassline. This is me recreating the bassline from the first drop of Isla Mujeres by Jillax and All in One. So it's a really cool song, and I'm just studying it. So not my sound, but it sounds cool. So if you like it, go listen to them. So here's what it sounds like without kind of the processing that I'll talk about in a second. So it sounds pretty cool and everything, but there's a huge problem here. A bunch of these notes effectively have this sort of processing tail, I think is a good way to call it. So what ends up happening is due to all the extreme amounts of processing that you need to do on a psytrance bassline for it to sound cool, essentially, you get this sort of processing tail. Let me demonstrate what that means. Let me kind of temporarily get these notes out of the way. So here's a MIDI note, right? Note that I do have sustain, or excuse me, release set to 0 milliseconds and attack set to 0 and everything. So in other words, you would expect the sound to start here and end here, right? Attack here, release here, no sound here. That's what you would expect, and that's what would be great, but the reality is here's what ends up happening. I'll record this track into here. You get this processing tail. So the reason this ends up happening is a lot of multiband plugins that are used in this sort of psytrance-based processing chain, they do a lot of kind of phase rotation and pushing, effectively taking the bass frequencies and pushing them forward in time. So you kind of have more high frequencies here, and then the bass frequencies kind of gradually start up over here. You do this with a bunch of different low-pass filters and various other, basically just a bunch of filters. And what filters do is cause phase rotation, and that is kind of the most common way to make this happen. Other ways might include things even like reverb or delay or anything if for some reason you're using those in your bass lines. But most likely this kind of low frequency tail ringing thing caused by phases and filters and stuff, that's what's going to happen most of the time. So yeah, typically, unless you're not doing any processing, you're going to have something like this. So the way that it's common to deal with this is you would bounce this note. And here I'm going to show you the solution that is, well, it works, but it's very tedious. So you would take this, you fix that little fade so that you don't get a little click at the end, right, where it's not at the zero crossing. So you bring it down, make it a little smooth. Perfect. Okay, let's do the next note. Okay, let's press this one, record it. Obviously we have the same problem. Right, and this is just, once again, demonstrating what I think is kind of the way it's done, but it is just very tedious. Alright, so you get the point, right? You bounce them one by one, and you clean them up, right? Obviously, since not every single note is going to be different, you could probably reuse this one here, and maybe this one would make sense here. So with this one's different, so I have to bounce it, right? Etc, etc. So here's the thing, right? You can do this once, and maybe it's not so bad, right? I mean, you got 16 bars here. Maybe you have like another 16 bars of drop, a different rhythm here, whatever. It's not too bad. Maybe it'll take you like 5 minutes to do this. But what happens when you want to change your bassline patch, right? Here I have this sick serum patch. It sounds awesome, but I want to go in and I want to change something. Well, guess what? Now I have to do exactly the same process for all of these notes. And you can do that once, you can do that twice, but eventually it's just ridiculous. I mean, it gets very tedious, and honestly, it makes you not want to even change your bassline anymore. Maybe you changed your patch, you changed your processing, anything at all. Now you have to completely redo everything. And the worst part is, you won't actually even know how your bass will sound with your kick or with your other bass notes until you have gone through this process. So what ends up happening is what's called your iteration cycle, like how long in between, like how long it takes you to make a change and kind of get the feedback for it. That becomes really long, right? Even if you're just doing one bar, you make a change, you have to do this process individually for every note. So it could take you like 30 seconds to even find out if your change sounds good or not. So this is a huge problem. It's a huge workflow killer. So allow me to demonstrate. I'll just make a new audio channel down here. I've built a sort of a rack that will handle this. So these are all the same notes, it's all the same stuff. But, well, I'll just immediately bounce it to audio to save time. But I think you might even hear how it sounds cleaner. Let me turn that on. Watch as it is already, well, perfect. Alright, so here we are. We'll ignore the fact that there's sidechaining built in. I could have done that here as well. But what I really want you to pay attention to, also I don't need this automation, what I want you to pay attention to is how these tails are just perfectly cut off right here, and they even include a little fade, right? Like here we are, and boom, faded out. Here as well, right? Normally this kind of wave would go all the way down here, and then it would be cut off, but I even have a little fade included. So now every time I make a change, I just instantly get my feedback. I know exactly what's going to happen. There are no weird tails that, no sub is going to interfere with like the transient of the kick or any ugly stuff like that. Things that you would never want in your final version anyways, or any version, honestly. So, how did I do this? That is what I will explain in this video. Alright, so how do we make the bass so clean when we bounce it? So I'll explain this kind of in a few steps, building our way up to the final solution, because it's a lot to take it at once, but if you understand why everything works the way it does, I think it's not impossible to figure out how it all works. Everything makes sense, but we'll start from the basics. So what we're going to start with is a very simple, sort of naive, I called it here solution, but it works. It's, it's on our way to the right kind of final place. And the core idea is whenever we have a note playing, whenever we have a MIDI note kind of being held, we allow signal through, and whenever it's not being held, we do not allow signal through. So what this lets us do is, well, cuts off all these tails, right? So the tail that we saw earlier, it's going to be over here. It's not going to be here. And likewise here, and so on. So at first glance, this seems like a great solution, right? In fact, let's bounce it and take a look. So guess what? We did it, right? We're good. It's perfectly cut off. Well, actually, it's a tiny little bit off here, but this problem will go away in a second. This is a slightly sort of contrived example. The reason this is happening is something that I'll explain in a second, but with some simple configuration, we could get rid of it. It's just that the final solution, that doesn't matter there, so I didn't bother fixing it here. But what you need to understand is generally this approach works. It's only ever playing when this note is being held, and there's a certain release. Well, actually, this one that I'll talk about in a second. This is set to 1 millisecond, so it's just an extra millisecond worth of stuff here. But effectively, though, that's it, right? Like, we're good, or so you would think. The problem happens here, right? So we have our MIDI kind of on, like the gate, so to speak, is open. So this signal is playing, and then this one starts and this one plays, but this doesn't solve for the fact that they overlap. And in fact, if you take a look, you'll see that there's some really weird stuff. Let me even zoom in a little bit, right? There's some really weird stuff going on here. This double transient, like this kind of ugly stuff, this is not how the transient is supposed to look for this patch. It's supposed to be much cleaner, and I can even demonstrate what it's supposed to look like. Get rid of this just in case. Watch how it is now with this kind of double transient thing. Here's what it's supposed to look like, right? This cool instant transient right on the spot, and it's cleaner. This versus this, totally different. And the reason this happens is very simple. It's the same reason we saw earlier. What we're actually doing here, clean this up a little bit. So let's first bounce this note to understand what's going on. We have this note playing, but the MIDI situation is already fixing it, so I'm gonna go ahead and just disable the solution. We have a note playing, and it has all this tail. And then we have this note playing, and they're layered on top of each other. So all that sub bass from here is being layered into here. I mean, it's horrible. It's just completely canceling everything. This is not what we want. So Before I explain how to fix that, let me at least explain how I got here, because this will be kind of the building block in our eventual solution. The way this works is we're using the envelope MIDI device, and we're mapping that to the utility. So it seems pretty simple. Basically, whenever we receive a MIDI note, we bring it all the way up, mapping it from 0 to 50% here, so it goes from negative infinity all the way to exactly 0, so it acts as a sort of gate. And then as soon as we release the note, after a millisecond, we immediately go back down to no signal. Note that I actually had to modify this Max for Live device to be able to make it 0 milliseconds. Otherwise, I think it starts at 0.1 milliseconds, which of course will mess with your transient a little bit. The way that you modify this is you would take the envelope MIDI device. It would look exactly the same. Just drag in envelope MIDI. Let me even demonstrate, right? Take envelope MIDI. And I'll show you how to bring this down so that, well, same thing with release, but that's not going to matter in a moment, and I'll explain why. But for the attack, at the very least, we want to take this 0.1. We go into this little modifier thing here. Open this up. You want to unfreeze this device. Click here. Click on this inspector panel here. And then you got to scroll down and find... Here it is. You want to just, it's pretty simple. Just change this to 0 and press enter. Right, and then you would save it as another device, right? You know, press Command S or whatever, save it as another device. In my case, I saved it as this envelope MIDI 0 attack device. So yeah, don't save just because I already did it. Get rid of that. And we have this envelope MIDI with a 0 attack, and this allows our transient through perfectly. And so what then you end up doing is you go into this mappings menu here, you know, click like this button here. I just don't want to undo the work that I already did, but effectively you would map it, you would click on this gain here. So this works if you have a utility plugin at the end of your chain. Ignore all these other things, these aren't relevant to what we're talking about right now. You map this gain, or rather what this envelope is modulating to the gain of this utility, and that kind of wrapper acts as a sort of gate around it, which only lets sound through when the MIDI is currently on. So that's our first step in getting this to work. So how do we fix this overlap problem? The way we're going to do that is by using another rack that I've developed, which distributes MIDI notes, incoming MIDI notes, in round-robin fashion through a pool of voices. In this case, I have 3 voices because I think is sufficient for what I'm doing here. But effectively, you have 3 voices, and all of the incoming notes are distributed into all 3 of these voices. And I actually have another video explaining this. The link for that should pop up on your screen, and then I'll also put a link in the description. But all you really need to know is that the expression control here is going through 3 steps from values 0, 1, and 2, which is kind of going through this chain selector here in cyclical fashion and selecting each voice one at a time. So in fact, if we even just kind of listen through it, we'll see kind of which one is receiving the signal. So as you can see, it's cycling through. So let's see the end result and understand why we got where we did. So here's our perfect end result. It looks amazing. There's no place, and then there's no place. And just to demonstrate that this is awesome, that this is functional, well, there's no overlap here. I will bounce it kind of in its pure, clean form, and we can see that they're going to be the same. So let me just kind of extend this, compare, right, here's our transient, it's kind of looking cool all the way through, and if you do this, it looks the same. There's a teensy-weensy little difference that keen observers might spot here. That's because this tail does extend another millisecond into here due to that kind of problematic release on the envelope, but that won't be a problem in the final solution that we'll get to. But this is already pretty darn close. It's just slightly messing up the transient. Honestly, it might not even matter, but, well, we're going to make it even cleaner. But in general, though, this does basically do what we need it to do. So the reason this works, it's important to understand why I went with this round-robin approach. Effectively, what we're doing is instead of having this whole thing keep all of the signal open. We're only having this MIDI note keep the signal open for this MIDI note, and this one for this one. So in fact, if we actually just don't even have that second note, well, we can really visually see what's going on. Now everything works essentially exactly how you would expect, right? This MIDI note starts, and then it ends, and then it cuts off the signal, which in this case is in, well, let's call it voice 1, for example. So voice 1 is being cut off by the MIDI from voice 1, and then voice 2, kind of while voice 1 is still being cut off, they're existing in different channels at this point. They're completely independent of each other. They're in the same channel, but they're not really interacting with each other. They're really separate, and that's what makes this work. So we're going to see the same thing here. This is already kind of from our earlier solution. The signal will end here, and it's done, right? So it's perfect. But the important thing to understand is because these are kind of into different voices, the MIDI note for this one closes this, and the MIDI note here closes this. And so that's what generally makes all of this work. And in fact, if I were to bounce this whole bass line, we would actually get a pretty workable thing with no weird overlaps, no clicks, nothing. It would actually be a pretty good solution, essentially. But the one thing it's not really accounting for is sometimes what you want to do is instead of just cutting it off and maybe having the equivalent of like a teensy weensy like insta-fade here, sometimes actually it's kind of cool for like rhythmical purposes to give it a bit more fade out like this, right? Like, or sometimes even really aggressively, like all the way through. Because what this kind of actually does is, especially if you open up, well, if you put a like a low pass filter on the entire mix and you just listen to the sub bass, it's actually a huge difference if you do this or not. So in fact, I recommend generally trying this out. But what this kind of does is instead of the sub bass from both notes blending into each other, makes this one way punchier when it starts after it's been quiet, kind of in the sub bass region for a bit longer. So in other words, this isn't just kind of a fixing the overlap solution. This is a kind of a stylistic choice as well, this fade. But our solution here, well, it'll solve the problematic situation where there's the overlap. But let's say I really like how it sounds when it's like this. Well, then I'm not really saving myself the trouble because I still have to go in and, for all these notes, I would go in and, I'd fade out this one, I'd fade out this one, and so on every time I bounce it. So we're still not totally there, although we're getting close. We're there because we've cleaned it up, but we haven't really accounted for this automatic fade out that I don't want to bother doing manually every time, right? So how do we do this automatic thing? That is what I will explain in a moment. So how do we automatically fade out the notes so that they look, not only do they stop at this cutoff point, but they also gradually fade out at whatever rate we want to make it clean and stylistic, and basically so that we don't have to manually go in and kind of do the little fade like these little guys over here. We don't want to do that every time. And I will show you a way how to do that. So let me go ahead and first bounce the solution so that you kind of understand where we're trying to get to. So let's go ahead and take this example. This is now, not only is it perfectly at 0, this is the 0 crossing right here. We are at 0 amplitude here. We also have this fade, right? This one is being faded out. With the solution I'll present in a second, we could even kind of extend it further back, but I have a 20 millisecond fade out, actually. And that's enough to kind of slightly decrease the amplitude of this one and really kind of carve out this one. Everything else is exactly as we've seen it before. Once again, same fade out, same little fade out. It's just a little hard to see, but it's also being faded out in the same way. And so on and so forth. So, how did we get here? Is this is huge, right? This is such a huge time saver. In order for us to get this to work, we need to send our MIDI into the past. Here's what I mean. What the solution is effectively sort of predicated on is that we take this MIDI and, well, we know that we can open and close a gate based on MIDI on and note on and note off messages. And we know that we can use the, where is it here? We have a envelope MIDI right here. This is kind of a bit of a spoiler, but we have a release. So we have a release setting. So if we were to somehow have access to this MIDI, but shifted 20 milliseconds into the past, then we would know that this little spot here, this is roughly, for example, 20 milliseconds for illustrative purposes. Then we could just turn it on when it starts here, because that would obviously let the transient through perfectly. And it would also do a gradual fade out if we kind of shift it back, and then using that exact same, for instance, 20 milliseconds, we also have a release time of 20 milliseconds. And that way the signal would open up, let the transient through, and then 20 seconds before the whole thing ends, we would gradually fade it out based on the curve of our release envelope. So how do we get this to work? How do we send our MIDI 20 milliseconds into the past? Well, at Ableton, well, or I mean in general, you can't really send things into the past. It's not really a paradigm that works. What you kind of have to do is flip your thinking around and send everything else 20 milliseconds into the future. So you're going to introduce a little bit of delay with this method, but I think it's fine. It's not a lot. And it generally does get the job done. So you send everything else 20 milliseconds into the future. And here's how we do all this. So we have all the same stuff we've been looking at. We have this expression control to kind of get the MIDI in, you know, it's kind of doing the round robin stuff. And here is where the magic happens. All we really need to do is delay the signal by 20 milliseconds. So in other words, we just, you know, it's dry wet is 100, feedback is 0. You could probably do this with some other kind of time-based plugins. It doesn't matter. All you're really doing here is just taking the exact same signal and just putting it 20 milliseconds into the future. You're just giving it a bit of a delay, right? And so after that happens, we are then using the same envelope MIDI and also modulating the same utility. So what we're really doing, if we actually think about it kind of in a more rational way, is this MIDI is still where it is, but the difference is the incoming notes are now effectively shifted, so the actual audio signal starts 20 milliseconds later. And so if we now imagine that this is the audio signal, right, just pretend that it's the audio, then our MIDI is cutting it off here. Rather, it's kind of slowly applying the release envelope kind of over this period of time here. So in fact, let's kind of do a quick simplified version of this whole thing, and you'll see that that's exactly what's happening. Everything's shifted forward, and we have this release envelope here. Right? So it's exactly what I described. It's shifted sometime into the future. We see that we have this sort of fade out. This is perfect because this is what we want. But now everything is shifted relative to this whole thing. This is actually 20 milliseconds actually. Right, so now we see that, well, we're getting close because we have a fade out. But the problem is our signal is delayed. I mean, you can visually see that here's where the MIDI note is, here's where the signal is. But we're close, right? We're really close. And just to kind of recap how we got here, I'm going to hide the little spoiler. So for each of these voices, all we're doing is, hopefully that's not too visually confusing. For each of these voices, we're just adding in a little delay here, right? We delay it by 20 milliseconds. And what ends up happening is because this delay is after this envelope MIDI device, the delay happens afterwards, but the MIDI that is controlling the utility here is still looking at the MIDI that, relative to this delay, to this newly delayed signal, it's effectively looking 20 milliseconds into the past. This is kind of 20 milliseconds behind, and this is being modulated by this envelope MIDI device, which is still being powered by the same MIDI that has not been delayed yet. So this is really key to understand. If you put the delay kind of in between like this, you take the pre-delayed signal, but you modulate the delayed signal. This is a really neat trick that took me a lot of head scratching to figure it out. Believe me, I wasted a ton of time on this. Well, I won't say wasted. I'm very happy with the solution, but it was not easy to figure out how to put notes into the past. But this is how you do it, right? It makes sense. And one thing to note here is also just I've been using this processing chain the whole time. You may have noticed this little blip here. This is just all my processing. It doesn't matter. I could remove it, but what I'm trying to say here is that this is not part of the solution. All you need to know is this envelope MIDI device. Here's your serum, your delay, and your utility. These are kind of the pieces that you need to assemble in this exact order. And note that what I'm doing here is I'm setting this thing to modulate the gain as we did earlier, but the secret is having this release right here. So this release is set to 19 milliseconds. I could set it to 20, 19, doesn't matter exactly too much as long as it's not more than 20 or more than your sort of delay time here, right? We just need to make sure that it's not longer because then the signal would not be 0 when the next note starts. So as long as it ends before the next one starts, then everything kind of lines up neatly. So I'm using the number 20 for now. So this pretty much gets us basically to the solution, right? But with the one little caveat that it's shifted 20 milliseconds into the future. So what you could do is you can even just use Ableton's native sort of thing and just shift it back that way. That would honestly work fine. With that said, I actually prefer for everything to be really neat and perfect without these little things that are easy to kind of lose track of and they make everything confusing. So I found a Max for Live device called SL Signal Delay Pro. You do have to pay $3 for this Pro version. So in other words, if you don't want to pay those $3, you would have to do it with this track delay. I think that would work fine as well. I paid the $3 because I think it's a really useful little thing for this specific case. So you turn this on, and it just really does the same thing. All it does is I set it to negative here, negative 20 milliseconds, matching all these other kind of 20 milliseconds here. And that brings it back into the past. So if we record exactly the same thing, we see that now it ends perfectly where we need it to, because this past signal is modulating the note here and then shifting it back. So now at this point, what we're really conceptually doing relative to sort of each other is this is where the MIDI signal that it's kind of using to modulate everything starts. This is the length of the release tail, in this case 20 milliseconds, and this is kind of our note itself. And this little spot right here is the key to everything, right? That's how you get that fade out. Because it's the MIDI note itself is 20 milliseconds in the past relative to the audio signal, thanks to this delay. I think this is a pretty neat trick. As you can see, it works really well. You know, there's no, I mean, the transient is it's perfect. It looks exactly the way it needs to. It's right here. There's no, I mean, this is clearly at 0 for a little while, right? Because of that extra millisecond. Since my release is set to 19, so it's ending around here. I have a little bit of silence and bam, the next note starts. So this is a fully functional solution. This is how you would do it. All right, so let's bounce the whole thing and take a look. Alright, so just to take a quick look, we see that everything is perfectly cut off here. A little bit of a fade, you can see how this thing is getting a little smaller. And getting down to 0 here with a little fade. Now this transient looks nice and centered and clean, exactly how I wanted it to sound. So on and so forth. Everything looks perfect. That's it. There's no more gotchas. This is actually the functional solution. So to recap, the way we're doing this is we're using the round robin method to distribute our notes across 3 different voices, and that way everything is effectively in its own channel. And then we are using the envelope MIDI device to modulate the gain of the audio signal, but the audio signal is 20 milliseconds slower than the MIDI note. So effectively we're taking the MIDI note that is, relatively speaking, 20 milliseconds in the past and using that to bring down the gain. And then to compensate for all of this, because of course now our audio signal is 20 milliseconds behind, we just shift it 20 milliseconds back. And that way, after all of this routing and processing and so on is done, everything ends up where it's supposed to be, with this release envelope perfectly cutting it off over the time of this delay. So this all matches up really nicely. It's a really cool solution. I think, well, these are all my macros, ignore all that stuff, but yes, it's a really cool solution. It all works fine. Just make sure to generally copy what I have on the screen here. So building it up, we have our round robin rack with all these multiple voices. Check out my other video for instructions on how to do that. And then just make sure to have everything in the exact same order here, where you have your envelope MIDI device, your Serum, or whatever other synth you're using, whatever processing you might want to have, you put that before the delay. So you delay the fully processed signal. And then you make sure that this envelope MIDI device is modulating the gain on this utility right here. Lastly, you just want to make sure that all of your delays and stuff match up. So because I use 20 milliseconds, I have 20 milliseconds set here. I have no more than 20 milliseconds on the release. I'm just being extra careful with a millisecond of silence. And then I'm sending everything 20 milliseconds into the past. which I could do with this track delay, but I chose to do it with this Max for Live device. Yeah, I hope this comes in handy. I have a few other tricks that I can show in the next part of this video, but otherwise that is kind of the main thing of this video. I hope this comes in useful. I think it's a huge time saver, so enjoy using it. So some of you may have noticed that when I bounce my audio, this note right here is already quiet. And that's really convenient because it avoids the problem that I spent all this time figuring out a solution for, which is having to do stuff after you've bounced your audio, having to go in and manually mess with it and so on, right? Normally, it's a pretty common way to sidechain your notes, right? If you have a kick and then 3/16ths, you can take the first 16th, right? You'd probably do something like this, bring it down by, 12 dB or 10 or whatever number that you like that sounds good in your track. And then you would do this. But the problem is, once again, you would have to bounce everything and then go in one by one, right, wherever there's a little 16th note, and do the same thing. That's exactly the thing I'm trying to avoid with all this work. So how did I get it to immediately have the right volume? The way I did it is by using this kind of combo of the compressor and expression control. So I'm using the same expression control as I was using earlier with this incrementing round robin thing, except this time I'm using the velocity tab. Since I can modify multiple things, it's very, very convenient device. You take the velocity tab, and the trick is to map it to the dry wet of a compressor. And what am I doing with this compressor? As you can see, the threshold is minus infinity, and we have an infinite ratio, a really short attack. And what we're doing here is effectively just completely killing the signal whenever it receives any sidechain input. In this case, the sidechain input is this track. So we have three voices, post effects. Yeah, there's a lot of devices in that rack. So three voices, post effects. So effectively, if this were set to 100%, it would completely cancel itself out. But we don't want it to be 100% all the time. Instead, we want to modulate it with the velocity. So what I'm doing here is, if you take a look, you'll see that the velocity is all the way at the top here and at 35 here. And what this really translates to is that the velocity here is setting the dry wet of the compressor to 0%, and this is setting it to like roughly 70 or so. I mapped it in reverse, it's going from 100% to 0. So if you look closely, you'll see that it kind of jumps around. There you go, 72%, right? These are all going to be 0. And then this one note is kind of compressing it just for that period of time at 72%, which is enough to bring it down by just about 12 dB. It sounds good. I listen to the lower frequencies. I'm happy with this amount of gain reduction, so this works for me. As a quick side note, I recommend this method of sidechaining. I don't think that the kickstart method, where it's kind of a gradual curve, with LFO tool or whatever else that you want to use, gradually kind of bringing up the volume, I don't think that sounds as good. I actually think it's just a very simple and elegant solution to bring the first note down by some amount. It gives it a bit more groove and it sounds better in the sub-bass region, so I recommend giving that a try. And because that's what I'm doing, I had to come up with this compressor idea, and it works well. So I recommend doing it this way. Just have the velocity modulate the dry wet of your compressor. As a side note, you could probably also do this with some other plugin of some kind that also is messing with the volume or the gain in this part of the audio signal. With that said, I did not have success using the utility plugin. Naturally, my first choice was to grab the utility plugin and automate the gain, similarly to what I'm doing kind of inside this round robin with the envelope MIDI. So I wanted to do that with the utility, but it didn't work because I think, well, I'm actually not exactly sure why it didn't work, but what I did find was that the transient would kind of be full volume and then the utility automation would kick in. Maybe it has something to do with how exactly the audio is routed through Ableton's various processing chains and whatnot. I really couldn't say. Could also be just because this is a Max for Live device and those are a little bit weird sometimes. But one thing I did find was a compressor, it worked great. I think probably this 1 millisecond look ahead is what's really making it work perfectly. Just making sure that it's really capturing that transient exactly how we expect it to. And that really did the trick. So that was kind of the full solution here. And as a last addendum, some of you might be wondering how I'm doing my sidechaining. I think so. I recently discovered this Duck Buddy Max for Live device. It's free, so I recommend that you download it. There's a bunch of other volume shaper type Max for Live devices. Some are better, some are worse, some are easier to use, some are harder, etc., etc. With that said, I think that this one honestly works pretty well. It's pretty similar to like LFO tool or something. You just draw in a curve, you set in your length, everything else, and so on. But what's nice about this is that you don't have to have a MIDI track that is sending its output into it, but rather from here is where you select your kind of what MIDI is coming into it. That way, if you duplicate this device, here for instance, just as a quick example, it's already using the same sidechain trigger. You don't need to create like another MIDI track like you commonly need to do with tools like LFO tool. Instead, it's just already working the way you expect it to. It's a really nice solution, and it saves me a ton of headaches because otherwise, especially in Ableton, unfortunately, tools like LFO tool and other volume shapers can often get out of sync, and so they'll end up like starting their volume envelope here or something if there's some latency, because Ableton is very bad at compensating for plugin latency in certain situations. So it'll be all like this, and it's going to be all weird, and basically I recommend doing it with something like one of these Max for Live devices. If you're on Ableton, highly, highly recommended. And that's it. That's the whole thing. So now, I mean, the whole point is that we don't even need to bounce anything, right? We just, here's our main solution. Here's our 3 voices that I kind of did all this stuff with. And we can just listen to our sick bass line now. There you go. It's perfect. There's no clicking. You can even, whoops. Check out our oscilloscope. Perfect, right? The bass is always kind of a nice constant volume. I could probably make this transient a little bit better, but there you go. It's just some extra stuff I have over here. But the point is, everything is exactly the way we expected. Finally, everything is intuitively in line with what the MIDI is doing here. Whoops. We have a MIDI, starts, ends, and that's where the signal is, even including a fade. That's the full solution, folks. I hope it's not too complicated because I did build it up step by step, but this is the chain I came up with, and it's a massive time saver because now whenever I change anything on my various patches, I just instantly get feedback for it. I instantly can hear how it sounds. So as a quick side note here, I will mention that for this method to work, you do need to take your patch and you copy it into all 3 voices. And you need to make sure that you take your processing chain, that's this one, right before the delay, and you are also going to have to copy it into each one. Have your processing chain, like so, and all of your devices, everything looks exactly the same. So it's an unfortunate kind of part of the solution. There's no real way to get around this because you can't have like a single global instance of this exact processing chain that is processing multiple independent signals. Ableton's not flexible enough for that sort of thing as far as I know, so you do have to copy and paste it. What this means in practice is you may want to change your patch, and you would have to update your patch here, and then you would have to kind of copy paste your processing chain here. It's not I mean, I still think it's a much better way to do it than having to bounce everything and fixing everything manually, but it is something to keep in mind. So for what it's worth, one thing you can kind of alleviate this with is by just mapping as many things you can to macros of the whole rack. So this way, right here I have all of these macros mapped here, and these are shared across all these Serum instances. And this is saving me some time in case I do want to change one of the patches. At least I don't have to redo all the macros and stuff. Likewise for the processing chain, if you're messing with like your limiter threshold or anything like that, you can map that to a macro and keep it consistent. That's one way to kind of deal with it. So just as a recap of the entire processing chain, in case you need it for reference or just to kind of understand everything all the way through, going from left to right, we start with an expression control, making sure that we have this increment set up correctly. This is what's making our round robin work. So we have the target for this thing set up to modify this chain selector right here. This is mapped to this, making sure that if you have 3 voices, you have 3 steps. and you have from 0 to 2 here. So just make sure that all this lines up. As a side note, you could do more voices. That would be totally fine. That would allow you kind of extra buffer time if you have really, really long post ringing from your processing. Realistically, I think 3 voices should be fine, or maybe 4. But if you have 3 voices, you do 3 steps. If you have 4, you do 4. Now, continuing on, each of these looks effectively the same inside, so I'll just go over one. So for example, for voice number 1, the first thing is we have an envelope MIDI, and this is modulating the utility gain right here. After the delay, we have an envelope MIDI. Make sure that this amount is 100%, attack is 0 with the kind of manual modification necessary that I described earlier in the video. But essentially you go into here, you click on this knob and you make sure that it can go down to 0. This is modifying the gain, like I said earlier. Then we have your serum patch or whatever other synth you're using. Your processing chain, this is the spot where it goes. So all your limiters and saturators and all the other cool stuff you're doing, that goes right here before the delay. That's really important. Then you do your delay. Pick a number. I think 20 milliseconds is a pretty reasonable time, but that depends on what you want. So in this case, I picked 20 milliseconds. Just make sure that it all matches up. Specifically, that it matches this value right here, minus 20 milliseconds on everything. So minus 20 here, 20 millisecond delay here, and that your release is no more than 20. In this case, I picked 19 to kind of keep it safe, but effectively, you want your signal to be at 0 before the next note comes along, and that's what that 20 millisecond window is for. Note also that you can modify the curve here, and that's what allows you to change the shape of your fade out, and so that way you can have a bit more control over that. I suggest mapping that to a macro knob as well as all the rest of these things to keep everything nice and customizable and flexible. And just to kind of drive it home, all of these devices are exactly the same. They're all just modifying their respective gain here. But otherwise they are the same. Like I said, I mapped everything to a macro knob, so it's really easy to change if I need to. Lastly, for my kind of pseudo sidechain for my first of 3 16th notes, I have a compressor set up where I have the audio from the same track that I'm doing this from. So I'm calling it 3 voices in this case. Audio from 3 voices. Make sure to do post effects, not pre effects or anything else. Make sure the EQ is off and everything so the signal is the same. This is set to negative infinity. This is set to infinity. Make sure the look ahead right here is 1 millisecond so that the transient triggers it correctly. And you want a linear envelope, not logarithmic. And for this compressor to work, I'm going to go all the way back here, and we take the velocity. And the target for the velocity is the dry wet of the compressor, all the way over here. There it is. And then make sure that the output range looks like this. That way, you have a high velocity note, it's louder, and a low velocity note is quieter. So it kind of makes more sense this way. That way, if you have a note, mine are like 35 and then 127, and that behaves kind of how you would expect. Lower velocity makes it work properly. Lastly, I recommend using something like DubBuddy or some other sort of Max for Live device that can directly specify where it wants its MIDI from, rather than having to externally route MIDI from another channel into here. This is a really neat way to sidechain. So I recommend doing it this way. And that's the full chain.